Hello again, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Resilient Health Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Darin Ingels, and joining me on the podcast today is Nicole Bell. Nicole is the CEO of Galaxy Diagnostics, which is a laboratory that a lot of us in the Lyme world use to help diagnose Lyme disease and other tick-borne illness. And just a little bit of background about Nicole. She has a degree from MIT, very impressive, in material science and engineering, as well as a master's degree in biomedical engineering from Duke. So basically, Nicole's an underachiever. But she is leading the charge with Galaxy, and we're going to talk a little bit today about the laboratory, the type of testing that they do. So, Nicole, welcome to the show.
Great. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, you and I've talked before, and I know you've got a very personal story about how you kind of got into this whole Lyme world. And if you're okay, sharing it, I think it'd be really helpful for people to understand kind of where you're coming from.
Of course. I think I got into tick-borne illness the way that most people do when they kind of get dragged because either it impacts them or a family member. And in my case, it was a family member. So it was my husband. And he was really kind of changed, I think, at a fundamental level. So his first presentations were more mood-based. He was depressed, he was anxious, he was really just angry and irritable all the time. And we went to therapy. It didn't really work. I kind of attributed it to other things because we had young children at the time, and there were a lot of life changes that happened we had moved cross country, we'd had kids, like a lot of things had happened. And then I started realizing that he was actually forgetting things. So he was a brilliant engineer, computer scientist, electrical engineer, one of the smartest people I ever met. And all of a sudden, he couldn't remember the time to pick up our kids from daycare, and he couldn't remember the security code to our house alarm system. And I was like, wait a second, like something's going on here. And so I convinced this somewhat irritable individual, right, that something was wrong. And we went to the doctor. And actually, one of the first things I had him tested for was Lyme disease. I have that original email I sent to the doctor. And I was like, I'm really concerned because I had done some research on the internet, the Dr. Google, right? And Lyme came up as a possible issue. And he had been bit by many ticks. He was an avid outdoorsman. He was always in the woods. And so I was like, well, that seems to fit. So we had him tested. He tested negative. And then that doctor referred us to a neurologist because most of his issues were neurological.
Yeah.
And to make a long story short, he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease. Right. And so, and furthermore, like when he had his PET scan, they said that he was in the late stages of Alzheimer's disease. So we were still figuring out that something was wrong. And I was actually still trying to convince him that something was wrong. And they were saying he was in the late stages of cognitive decline. So it was like a huge baseball bat to the head. And I went from neurologist to neurologist trying to look for answers because he had no genetic predisposition, no comorbidities. He was doing all the things you're supposed to do for brain health, right? Eating a Mediterranean diet, getting exercise, all the things. And he was still declining young and rapidly. And fast forward about 15 months when I had pretty much given up because I just, there's only so many times you can go to a doctor and not get answers. And then you eventually start to lose hope. And my brother actually convinced me to reopen the tick-borne diagnosis because my sister-in-law had been diagnosed after her struggles with health and figured out that she had Lyme and Babesia and Bartonella. And sure enough, we went back, we got him retested and found out that he also was afflicted with Lyme disease, Bartonella, and Babesia. And I think that was really what was leading to his cognitive decline. And we treated, and he had variable response to treatment. But as I said, he was already in the late stages of disease. And then we lost another 15 months. And so his journey didn't end well. He actually ended up going into a resident care facility in 2019, and then he passed away in 2022. And so it really put me on a mission to, one, share the message. So I became an advocate. I wrote a book about our journey as a family, mostly to heal, because it was such a horrid, chaotic period of my life. And I'm a very organized, program manager, executive. I like to make sense and I like things to be in order. And I just had to process everything. And so I released the book. I kind of did a lot of advocacy work and joined with key organizations like the Center for Lyme Action. And But then I kind of came back to I'm an entrepreneur by nature. I've been doing startups since I graduated from MIT. My professor actually started a company and gave me the small company bug years ago. And so, and I've worked in diagnostics before. I've been doing medical devices and diagnostics for the last half of my career. And so I kept going back to that first doctor's visit where we got that negative test result. And I kept wondering what would be different if we had known and we hadn't lost those 15 months. What would happen if they had actually tested him, not only for Lyme, got an accurate result, but then also for co-infections and really told us where we were from the very beginning. And that's what led me to kind of, scan the space and look at all of the different companies out there. And it's eventually what led me to Galaxy.
Well, I think it's safe to say your story is unfortunately not uncommon. I think
Yeah.
there's so many people. I remember hearing about Chris Christopherson. For people I know, he's an actor, singer, very similar, was diagnosed with fairly early onset dementia. And I think for a while he had to give up kind of his career. Somebody figured out he had Lyme disease. He got treatment. And actually, I think he responded quite well. And I mean, he passed away some years ago, but I think just from natural causes and not specifically from tick-borne illness. But again, this idea that we've got testing that is just across the board, not very accurate, not very reliable, not very sensitive, and
Mhm.
yet doctors, patients are relying on this information in many cases to help decide, do we or do not go forward with treatment. Now, I think a lot of people in our camp are generally like, hey, if you've got clinical symptoms, whether your test is negative or not, we're probably going to give it a try and treat anyway. But, the conventional infectious disease doctors and the conventional medical community as a whole, I don't know necessarily shares that opinion. And if you don't have a CDC positive test, they say you don't have Lyme disease, you don't have a co-infection, therefore they just move on. And like you said, you went from doctor to doctor looking for answers, and it was just nothing, nothing, nothing. So I think, the work you're doing now with Galaxy is just, it's so critically important that we get better diagnostics so that all of us can help make better decisions on how to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to fight a pathogen that you don't know is there, right? And it's hard to get coverage and treatment for a pathogen that you can't prove that you have. And so for me, as I was looking, okay, how do we fix this problem? The diagnostics was the key because I think there's still a lot of development that needs to occur in treatment, right? Treatment
Yeah.
is a whole nother big challenge. But if you don't have a foundation of knowing that you're treating the right person or that after you've treated them that they got better and that they've cleared the infection, then you can't really you're going to be limited with how much you can do on the treatment side. And so I think it's the core problem and that's why it's the area where I decided to kind of dig in. Plus it also just happened to be where I have my professional experience, so it was really quite well aligned. Sometimes they say things happen for a reason. I kind of believe you have to make your own reasons, right? And so
Yeah.
that's what brought me here.
Well, for people who may not be in the know, conventional Lyme testing is an antibody test. It's a blood test, and it relies on basically the amount of antibody that you make against different proteins on the cell surface of Lyme. And the same is true if you're measuring against Bartonella, Babesia, or some of these common co-infections. Again, we're looking for the immune response. And typically, what they teach, conventional immunology, is you make IgM, immunoglobulin M antibodies, is the first kind of reaction to a microbe. And then after some weeks to months, your body starts making immunoglobulin G or IgG, and that's your secondary, what we call a latent response. So usually we're looking at IgG and IgM antibodies against Lyme, against Bartonella, against whatever, to give us clues about have you had exposure and is that exposure acute or is it something maybe you've been exposed to the past? But, we could probably rattle off any number of countless reasons why people don't have a robust immune response. And that never really gets taken into consideration when you're doing this type of testing. Like what if your exposure was 10 years ago?
Mhm.
Well, we know immunity wanes with time. So an antibody level now versus 10 years ago is probably not going to look the same. What if you have any element of immune suppression? Maybe you're on medication, maybe you're really stressed, maybe there's other things going on in your world that you just don't make a robust immune response. So, this kind of goes on, and this is why I think, we agreed that, antibody tests by itself are just notoriously not accurate, and trying to be able to use an antibody test as a long-term marker of success. I remember reading an article many years ago that showed that Borrelia antibodies can stay elevated for 20 years after you've been treated. So, does the organism really go away completely? Do we just keep it at bay? You and I talked just briefly before we jumped on here, talking about like shingles. Again,
Mhm.
you can get chickenpox as a child, you can get shingles as an adult. It's the same virus that's been in your body for 20, 30, 40 years that becomes opportunistic at some point and then comes out again when the immune system attacks. So, again, why we all understand this about shingles and other viruses, but we kind of ignore it with something like Lyme disease is a little perplexing, I think.
I completely agree. I mean, I think we talk to providers all the time and they're, saying, help me, discern what's going on with these antibody results. And it's hard because there's lots of every person, every host is different. And so the way one person reacts might be very different from the way that another person reacts. I mean, somebody like my husband, Russ, I'm convinced he'd probably been sick for a decade or more, right? I mean, in terms of when he got his initial infection. And then it kind of cascaded to this point where when we finally figure out he's in late stage disease, right? And he was really smart, so he was good at hiding a lot of his symptoms. And so, when we tested him, his antibody titers in general were low. His immune system was suppressed because he'd been ill for such a long time, and so that's a common situation with people who've been sick. And then at the end of the day, right, we want to get it as soon as possible, right? Like
Right.
as soon as you get bit, you want to know that you have that pathogen on board. And so early testing is the best time. That's when treatments are most effective. And that's when you're going to have the best success rate with current therapies. And antibodies take time to develop, and actually Borrelia has been shown again and again in the research to manipulate antibody response and kind of interact with the B cell follicles and the development and the class switching and all the things that happen in antibody immune responses to essentially screw up the system, right? And so using it as a marker for testing is inherently flawed. And so that's why one of the things that we do at Galaxy is we focus on direct detection, right? So and really that's the standard of care across all other types of infectious disease, right?
True.
So if
Yeah,
I tell people
absolutely.
like we all got a little bit of an infectious disease crash course in COVID, right? And if you want to know if you have COVID, you don't get an antibody test, right? I have antibodies for COVID because I've had it a couple of times and I've been immunized and so forth. And so if you want to know if you have COVID, you get an antigen test or you get a PCR test, right? But the problem is that in these tick-borne pathogens, they're not sensitive enough because these tick-borne pathogens, Lyme disease, Bartonella, and now we're actually increasingly realizing Babesia actually
Yeah.
can be really low-level infections that exist in quantities that are below the limits of detection of conventional techniques. And so if you use a standard antigen test or a standard PCR test, it's just not sensitive enough to pick it up. And so doctors have kind of said, well, that's not good enough. And then antibody testing is all that you're left with as the indicator of whether it's on board. And and as we know, that's flawed for all the reasons that you just talked about. And so what Galaxy's really focused on from the research that started back at NC State and then also our partners at George Mason is really trying to figure out how to solve that problem. How do you make the test sensitive enough so that you can actually make that an accurate testing methodology?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the technology you're using that's a little bit different than like standard PCR testing? Like I said, I've run PCRs on patients. To be honest, I don't think I've ever had a positive
Yeah.
ever. And
Yes.
I know, again, being a former lab tech, I was actually there when PCR first started in the early 90s when it took 10 days to do PCR, and now you do it in a matter of hours. But the technology is great when you can pick it up, but like you said, the threshold is not great. So what's a little bit different with Galaxy? What are you guys doing differently?
Yeah, so we really have two core technologies. And why do we have two? It's because really with these stealth pathogens, it's important to understand kind of the microbiology of the organism. Where is it in the body and how are you going to pick it up? And so for Lyme disease, Lyme doesn't like to be in the blood. right? It likes to, other than the very early stages of infection, it starts in your tissues and then it disseminates. And so there's a very narrow window where it's kind of circulating to find a host, but it likes to be in tissues. It likes to hide and be and burrow because it's a spirochete. It's kind of
Yeah.
like a little worm. It can burrow into tissues and actually get across key barriers of your immune system, like the blood-brain barrier, and kind of areas that are considered immune privileged, like your joints and your eyes and other types of places. It kind of has an all access pass. So for Lyme, really, blood testing is challenging. And so the approach that we use is actually a urine antigen test. And the reason for that is that Lyme it's kind of like a chameleon. It likes to shed its surface proteins and change the way that it looks. And it does that to confuse the immune system, right? Like if I'm wearing a red coat and then throw it off and I'm wearing a blue coat, it's going to be harder for the police to recognize me, right? And that's kind of
Yeah.
what Lyme does. It changes its surface proteins and it sheds those antigens into the bloodstream. It also likes to aggregate in the bladder. There's, actually in some of the early Lyme research, when they were doing studies in mice, one of the ways that they would tell whether the mouse was infected, they would harvest the bladder and then run PCR on that because the organism liked to adhere to the wall of the bladder. So urine's a really good matrix because all those antigens that are released get kind of filtered through the kidneys into the bladder and then excreted in the urine. Excuse me. And so we use a Lyme urine antigen test, which basically looks for those proteins. And we do a capture concentrate methodology. It was actually research that was originally done at George Mason University. And what they use these nanotrap particles that actually go collect all of the proteins in the urine, concentrate it down, and then look for detection. And with that, we've shown results in the published literature, George Mason, and then we're continuing that work here at Galaxy to show that the first sign of symptoms, you can actually get an accurate result before the antibodies even kick in. So it's great for early stage disease. And then in chronic disease, we're finding lots of patients where, you actually see whether or not that Lyme is still present because that direct detection capability is like, is the pathogen still present? Is it shedding the antigen, especially in like Lyme arthritis cases, that antigen is active and it can help tell you is, that case where you treat somebody and they're still sick. And just like you said, the antibodies are still present. They can be present for years. But if you have that indication of the antigen, then that's evidence that the pathogen is still having an effect. And so we use that as a way for doctors are using it, right now in our laboratory to kind of discern, is Lyme still a part of the active case, or is it maybe potentially something else that's keeping somebody sick?
So is it a little bit different than what you're measuring in the blood test?
Yes, so that's technology one, and then technology two is actually a blood-based assay. So for pathogens like Bartonella and Babesia, and actually relapsing fever Borrelias. So there's two kind of classifications of Borrelias. There's the Lyme Borrelias, and then there's the relapsing fever Borrelias. And relapsing fever Borrelias can be in high copy numbers in the blood, particularly during the febrile episodes. And so, sorry, I've got a little trickle in my throat. And so for those pathogens, they're in low abundance, so they're below the typical detection limits of PCR. But what we're doing is a couple of things. One, we're using the concept of sample enrichment. So particularly for Bartonella, we have a proprietary culture media where we actually grow up the pathogen and to increase the quantity so that you can do detection with PCR. And then we use what's called digital PCR. So the analogy I would use here is digital, like if you're looking at traditional conventional qPCR, it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, right? So, sorry. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. So you have a little bit of pathogen DNA and like a whole stack of human DNA. And so qPCR is like trying to take one shot and find that needle within the haystack, right? But digital PCR is a little bit different. It takes that haystack and it separates it into 20,000 piles, and then it interrogates each one individually. And so you're going to be much more likely to pick up that needle in that smaller haystack. And so is really just increasing the signal to noise ratio. So through proprietary sample enrichment protocols, plus the kind of best in class digital PCR technology, we're getting much higher sensitivity and better detection.
So if we compare that to like conventional like ELISA blood testing, antibody blood testing, again, depending on who you read, the standard two-tier CDC blood test from Quest and LabCorp, the sensitivity is somewhere in the low to mid 40%. How does Galaxy compare in that arena?
It's difficult to say because there's no good gold standard to protect, to compare it to, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that we're trying to understand with clinical utility. One study that was published for Bartonella by our collaborators over at NC State, they were looking for Bartonella in a high risk patient population. So veterinary workers have a lot of exposure to sick animals, and animals are on the front lines, right, of tick-borne illness because they're outside all the time. So in that high risk patient population, they were looking for, well, who is PCR positive for Bartonella? And there were 34 patients in total. And with qPCR, they only found that 3 were Bartonella positive. But with the enrichment technique and the digital PCR, they actually found that 18 of those patients were positive, right? So
Wow.
so it's a 6x improvement over conventional PCR. So significant improvement. Now, sensitivity, it's like, well, is that all that were positive in that group of 34? That's the difficult, question that we're constantly trying to answer and go for. But what we do know is that, it's definitely better, it's more sensitive. And then we also, you can look at that, you compare it with, the traditional serology methodologies that people are using. So for our Bartonella assay, we use titers, right? So we look at how much antibody people are being produced, and that will be an indicator as to whether there's an active infection. And you can put all that together to help you with the diagnosis.
I know when I met with you and the team a little bit ago, we were talking just about doing like a single blood draw versus potentially doing over three different blood draws. What do we see in terms of improving the diagnostics by doing multiple blood draws over, whatever period of time?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the reason we do that is that Bartonella is cyclical. So it lives in like the endothelial lining of your blood cells or of your arteries and vasculature. And it cycles as part of its life cycle, it cycles in and out of the blood. And so that's a 7-day cycle. And so it's kind of one of those things where it may not always be present in the blood tube. And so the research over at NC State found that if you do serial testing or serial draws, basically do 3 different draws over a 7-day period, you improve the ability to kind of capture it in the tube.
Yeah.
And so, the analogy that Dr. Breischwart over at NC State always uses is, look, if I'm in a boat and I have a bucket and I put that bucket in the ocean and I pull it up and I look at it. If I look at it and I say, well, there's no fish in the bucket, does that mean that there's no fish in the ocean? Right? It's like, no, it just means you didn't actually sample it with your bucket. And it's
Right.
the same with the blood, right? Every time you take a blood draw, it could either be there or not. And with that cyclical nature of Bartonella, we found that the serial draws really improve detectability. And we're actually finding a similar analogy for Babesia. And there, I don't think that it's really because of a cyclical nature of the pathogen. It's really just because it's in low abundance. And it's kind of like, did you catch it in the bucket or not? So as we're introducing Babesia into our assay, we're finding that um, we're improving our detection capability by doing those serial draws.
Great. Now, I know that, the gold standard of microbiology has always been direct detection. If I can grow out a bacteria on a plate, if I can, and interestingly, I see other labs unrelated to Lyme that are deviating away from that, trying to use PCR solely as the way to say you do or do not have something. But as far as I know, being able to actually see it directly is still the gold standard and still the best way to show this is what's actually present in the body or in the tissue at the time.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the gold standard, and that's what we're driving towards. Making present, prevalent and able for doctors to utilize it and really trust the results. And we're starting with the BBB, right? Because those are the trickiest pathogens. I think we've always known Borrelia is hard. We've known for a while that Bartonella is difficult, but as I said, we're finding even more like Babesia traditionally people have thought, well, it's a bloodborne pathogen, right? It impacts the red blood cells. And so it's readily abundant at relatively high parasitemia levels. But I
Yep.
think what we're finding in the research is that that's not true. Like, microti can be present in high levels, but there's also a class of Babesias which are known as sequestering Babesias, and they tend to be more in tissues. They aggregate in fibrin nests, and those are in much lower abundance in tissues. And those pathogens, that pathogen has not been accurately diagnosed, and we're recently just starting to discover it in these really complex cases with the sensitivity of the assay. It wouldn't have been detectable with traditional PCR, but now with these new techniques, we're saying, well, actually, this person does have Babesia. And then over at NC State, they're sequencing it and saying, well, you know what? This is Babesia oticoliae, which is a different type of pathogen, and it leads to different types of symptoms. And I have to be honest, like, I think that's one of the reasons why I don't think my husband got well is we didn't fully understand the implications of Babesia in his treatment. So he was diagnosed with antibody testing, and it showed that he had Babesia duncani. And if you look at that pathogen, right, he didn't have some of the traditional symptoms that are associated with Babesia. As it turns out, I donated his brain and tissues to science, and actually, hopefully, this will be published later this year. But we figured out that he actually has Babesia oticoliae in his brain.
Oh, wow.
And so that's a different type of pathogen that infects differently. And um, and I think what was happening, again, antibodies, the other thing that is misunderstood about antibodies is that they're often cross reactive, right? So antibodies go to some of these surface proteins of the pathogen, and different species within the same genus can have common surface proteins. And so a lot of times you're going to get cross reactivity among species and sometimes even across different genuses, like,
Right.
Borrelia, Bartonella. Sometimes if you don't have the right antibody pairs, they can cross react. And so this is something that I think, again, we're really just at the cusp of understanding with Babesia. And I think that it is actually a bigger contributor to some of these chronic cases than I think we've realized historically.
Well, I think there's such a great potential for you guys moving forward to really, I think, have a huge impact on the Lyme world because again, we've all kind of fluttered around, with antibody testing for a very long time. I mean, this has been going on for over 40 years, and CDC has never changed their criteria. And again, a little backstory is the standard testing out there was never designed to be diagnostic, FYI. It
Yes.
was used as a surveillance tool to monitor people who had known Lyme disease. And even according to the CDC's website, Lyme is still a clinical diagnosis. It's not a laboratory diagnosis. And yet most doctors can kind of ignore that criteria. So I'm hopeful, and actually I was going to ask you, kind of as we close out here, do you think that the eyes and ears at the CDC, the IDSA, are paying attention to the work you're doing, and maybe this might start changing policy moving forward?
Yeah, I absolutely do. So I think the CDC is definitely starting to shift. I mean, the whole vector-borne disease national strategy that was launched as part of the K. Tick Act is really shined a light on the gravity of these illnesses. And I think that there's some new staffers over there that are really paying attention and trying to figure out how to be more thoughtful about what the recommendations that they recommend. I've personally been involved in advocacy meetings with the CDC where they're listening to key advocates and trying to understand how can we communicate better? How can we provide more accurate information? So, change doesn't happen overnight. I know there's a lot of turmoil in the government right now, but I do believe that we're making progress. And I think that as we get better tools in the market, I mean, I've always said this and I say this to my team, it's even the FDA right on their wall when you walk in the building, it says, in God we trust, all others bring data, right? And so that's the key, right? You argue and you come armed with data that shows like this is what it says. And I think that's more and more over the last 5 to 10 years, research has resoundingly showed that these pathogens are linked to complex chronic illnesses. I mean, some work that
Yep.
I did before I joined Galaxy with the Center for Lyme Action, we put together the state of Lyme disease research, which is a paper I would encourage people to go on CLA's website and download and read. It was basically put together to help lobby Congress and summarize the research that's happened over the last 5 or 10 years to say, this is what the science says about the linkage between Borrelia and neurodegenerative disease, mental health disorders, cardiac conditions, all the things that have been hotly debated. Here's what the science says, right? You come armed with the data. And so a lot of private foundations have funded that research. And as we collect more evidence, I think that the government's going to they already are starting to pay attention. I think COVID really sparked this whole concept of, infection associated chronic illness, right? It's
Right.
like, even things like Alzheimer's is obviously true, near and dear to my heart after my husband's condition. And I remember after COVID, there was all sorts of research articles that said, well, Alzheimer's disease can be triggered by COVID. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. Alzheimer's can be triggered by an infection. Why don't you look at these other infections that we're talking about, right? And so I think we're getting there. We're getting there, but change doesn't happen overnight. And we're committed at Galaxy to providing the data to really support and the science to really go in with a legitimate argument.
And for people who might be interested in being tested, is this something they need to work with a healthcare provider to get tested through Galaxy, or can they order directly from the lab?
Yeah, no, you still work with your healthcare provider. I mean, tick-borne illness is something that we think should be done in conjunction with a provider. And so right now, you would need to go to a provider, but the good news is it's really to get set up as an account. And so you can work with your traditional provider if they're open to new testing methodologies. We'd be happy to help and have conversations to help them in that journey. Or if they would like to work with a Lyme literate provider, we can certainly help kind of point them to folks in their area that might be able to order the testing for them.
Yeah, and if you're working with anyone from the iLads community, I'm sure pretty much all of us use Galaxy in some way, shape, or form and have familiarity with the lab. So I don't think you'll have any arguments there. But yeah, from your conventional primary care provider, if they're not familiar, it might take a little coaxing. But like I said, you know, just encourage them to look at the data, check out the lab's website. So we'll put a link to the lab's website that you can feel free to share with your own provider if they're not familiar, help educate them about what you do, and hopefully they'll be willing to help, order that test. So again, that you can get good information about what's going on with your body. Because again, ultimately, diagnosis is really important. So again, that we're making the best decisions about whether you're dealing with Lyme plus co-infection. Again, all that information is really helpful for us on our side of the desk, again, to make better decisions about your health.
Yeah, and a lot of these co-infections or a lot of these, infections, the symptoms overlap, right? So I can't even tell you with even some extremely skilled and extremely well, versed physicians, they'll go in with a suspicion of one pathogen, and then when we do the testing, it
Right.
turns out it's another. Like it's really difficult to discern with a clinical diagnosis, and that's why we're so and that, as you know, like the treatments are different, right? Babesia is a parasite. Bartonella and Borrelia are still are both bacteria, but they're different, and they have different treatments in both traditional medicine and even in some of the herbs that people would choose. And so it's important to know what's on board. And so we're happy to help work with providers to help them discern.
Great. Well, we'll share all those links in the show notes. We're also going to drop a link for your book, What Lurks in the Woods. I think it's just a really interesting read and gives great insight to your own personal journey. But I think hopefully it'll be a spark for people to encourage them to, particularly when you have a loved one who's dealing with these sort of mysterious neurocognitive issues. We see it with Alzheimer's, we see it with MS, we see it with all sorts of various neurodegenerative diseases, that my first question when someone walks in is, hey, is there a possibility of a tick-borne illness? Because that's what really driving, even if you have the label, the question is always why, and
Yeah.
it's at least worth going down that rabbit hole to figure it out. So we'll put the link to the book in there as well. So again, Nicole, I'm really grateful for you spending time with us today. This is a lot of great information, and just always appreciative for you taking time out of your day to talk with us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
All right, thank you.